I wrote the book Beyond the War on Invasive Species by Tao Orion. The book started off really hot with a look at the corruption and unethical practices in the world of pesticides. This was really interesting. It raised a lot of good points, a lot of that being on the inadequate testing of pesticides. Only 7 of 20 required tests require you to test the full solution of a pesticide. So in all our tests, they're only checking the active ingredient. This means that inert ingredients, which have been shown to be hazardous, to cause cancer, and have other health-related issues, are not being included in these safety tests. And a lot of times they increase the effects of the active ingredients, so we might even be seeing the full spectrum of the active ingredients effects. It also talked about how there is limited species used when testing. For example, they use like maybe only mallard ducks to see how a certain chemical will affect all avians. They don't have required testings for reptiles and amphibians, which are known to be particularly sensitive because of their skins. And they also don't test for microorganisms, which can be really hard to see with the naked eye, these deaths, where if we can notice like lots of birds dying in response to something, we can find that body. You can't really see that with microorganisms, and a lot of times these are the backbone of a ecosystem. From there, the book jumps into the most popular pesticides, including glyphosate, imazapyr, and 2,4-D. And then 2,4-D actually has links to wartime use as being part of Agent Orange, which was shown to cause really terrible cancer and birth defects in the areas that it was used in during the war. Once it was banned, we moved to glyphosate, which is still used, commonly known as Roundup, which is actively, going through lawsuits because of cancer-causing agents. A lot of extensions, and that are usually popular for like providing information about pesticides and doing pesticide education, and even doing tests on pesticides, are receiving funding and donations from big pesticide companies like Monsanto. Although this wasn't mentioned in the book, I did look into this further, and the UW actually received a plant research facility from Monsanto, so this is happening even at like the local UW, which is just really concerning because pesticide companies are responsible for their testings that are done for safety, and when you are responsible for it and you're also donating to the people doing the research, there's a bit of a conflict of interest. It just leaves a lot of room for corruption. From here, the book jumps into taking a look at the role of invasive species in their environments. So a lot of times we're seeing that invasive species are cropping up in areas that are heavily disturbed and have gone through a lot of changes. We're thinking places like that have been a big source of agriculture, where maybe there is an overharvesting of species, or the edges of fields where there's now monoculture practice. And even areas like the Colorado River was used as one example, where we've directed a lot of water flow, and so the sides of these rivers aren't getting these big floods anymore because it's being used for so many other like human resources. That these species that can grow on the bank are changing, and so, for example, they were giving salt cedars were cropping up, but there's also higher levels of salinity to the water that go directly against the needs of the native plants that would typically grow there, which are going to be cottonwoods and willows. Those types of trees need a flooding of fresh water, which that area is just no longer receiving because so much of it is being directed into dams and used for agricultural purposes elsewhere. These points really flowed into what they called the systems approach of thinking, just seeing the full system beyond just that individual species and taking a broad look at why were these species here? Why are they outcompeting these and other native species? What does this provide to the environment here? Again, just ecosystems that have been disturbed are usually the ones that are being invaded, and they're usually filling some niche within that ecosystem that was not being fulfilled by the previous native species. And so finding what goal that species has in that environment and how it's helping can help us look at, okay, what is a native species that we want here, and how do we put it in this place so that we can get this looking how we want it to. But also assessing, is this species doing harm or is it helping us here? For, again, the example of the Colorado River, very fibrous roots were really helping the banks be stabilized in this area that has a lot of really rapid water flow that's very important to a lot of the United States. And there were cons listed as salt absorbed by the trees were making the soil saltier, but there was also increased salinity in the water, and through evapotranspiration that these trees are, removing salt from the water, although they're putting it back into the soil as leaf litter, they're also purifying some water in an area that we cannot be losing water flow, and so they're helping that water cycle keep going, and hopefully can be a pioneer species while we get other bigger species in there that we're happier to be seeing. The next portion of the book was dedicated to evolution and how the invasive species and the invasion process is at the heart of evolution. An example that it talked about is called the Berkeley Pit, which I believe is in Washington. There was a microorganism found there that is very old. A little bit more about the Berkeley Pit is it is a old copper mine, and it has been filled with water, natural groundwater, and is continuing to fill, and is at risk of polluting nearby water sources that are freshwater. The water has a lot of chemicals, a lot of heavy metals. It's highly acidic. It's about the same acid level as lemon juice, and it received a invasive species or pest, however we should be phrasing that really, from geese that landed there that were believed to be carrying it. The geese actually died in the lake afterwards, and they believe it was carried in the feces. This microorganism is so old that it survived in times where it was actually similar to the Berkeley Pit, so it is slowly consuming these toxic materials and heavy metals in its body, rendering it biologically inert, and then they're dying and leaving that as sediment. So it's actually purifying the water. We're watching evolution happen in the Berkeley Pit because there's now been 40 more species of microorganisms that they've seen develop from the Berkeley Pit. And they are becoming symbiotic, although they are invasive. So these invasives are actually supplying a really helpful biological resource to this environment that we really need and humans didn't have an answer for. Continuing with the idea of evolution, and using the example from the book of cane toads. So this really can be summed up as it is biologically efficient and in a creature's best interest to fit into a ecosystem, to find its place in a food pyramid of sorts. The cane toads were introduced to Puerto Rico to eat grubs in their cane fields, and it was rendered a success. They were very good there. They tried something similar in Australia to eat cane beetles, but these beetles typically lived on the top of the plants where the frogs could not eat them. So the beetles weren't eaten, and a toxic substance in the frog's skin actually killed a lot of native lizards and snakes that tried to eat the toads. However, there was an omnivorous creature, I believe it was a skink, that ate a similar invasive plant that had a similar substance that was somehow related to the substance in the frog's skin. So these skinks that were native were able to eat these invasive plants and these invasive toads now, and helped keep those in check because then the skink population boomed, and although they lost a lot of native reptiles, and that is something that should be really mourned and should not be taken lightly, we saw evolution happen by which species were able to survive and compete with these other ones that were invading. Just some numbers on biodiversity. So there was a study that the book referenced. It was done by Princeton that said one of the greatest threats to biodiversity is invasive species due to habitat destruction. But it is not really linked. It's usually more that invasive species take a benefit from habitat destruction, not necessarily that they're causing it. It also didn't take a look at monocultures and agricultural crops. They didn't give a specific number on how much space was occupied by invasive species, but in the same area study, there's about 23 million acres of agricultural crops that can be summarized as 3 different species that, I think it was like corn, soy, and wheat or something like that. And amongst all invasive species recorded in that same area, there was 33 different species. So there were actually greater biodiversity in the invasive species than there was in the monoculture agriculture that was there. One of the instances where we see that extinction is driven more by human interaction than it is by the invasive species themselves, and that invasive species are just taking advantage of the loss of and changing in habitat. So it touches a little bit on making solutions out of the problem, and that basically means taking a look at invasive species and seeing what they give back to the environment, which it touched on earlier, and it was really a big theme throughout the book. How are these invasive species providing food and shelter to native animals that we are happy to see? How can we use this as fiber? Maybe this is an invasive species that's great at nitrogen fixing. How can we, manage this in a way where we're getting the most benefits from it? How can we mulch these plants to give back to the native species that we want to see? How can we use it to fulfill human needs like fiber, food? How can we take these things that are usually a sink for tax money and resources and find a way to make something back on them while also managing them as a pest? The next portion of the book touched on the concept of native species, and I think this might have been my favorite section. It explained that native plants are typically seen as plants that occur naturally in the environment without human influence, whether it was intentional or not. And it dove into indigenous practices, and because native people cultivated what we consider wilderness areas for a long time before colonization, which we do have evidence of through dendrochronology in areas where we saw that conifers were a certain age where normally they would have been kept back by low intensity burns. When we were able to look at the age of the trees, they saw that trees were significantly greater in age when we saw big waves of disease strike through these. And disease was often through trading with Europeans, getting diseases like malaria, smallpox. I'm sure we've heard of this. Before, once large species of desired plants were reached, they would move to a new area and begin all over again. And at this point, these were the top canopy trees. And so, although there was management in place, they were also mimicking natural succession, which was a really good permacultural-based approach. But because there were these management practices, we don't know what native really means. And we have to think about how we're viewing that in a new way. But also because these practices have been significantly reduced due to populations being reduced from disease, war, and the freedoms of these people being so restricted and their lands being taken from colonization, these practices have been significantly reduced. And some of it just lost to time, unfortunately, which is incredibly sad. And these practices aren't being in place, and so we're seeing forests behave in a completely different way than they had before. So in a restoration sense, with that as an ecological science, how do we move forward? So in order for these restoration practices to improve beyond the use of pesticides that are damaging our environment and beyond trying to control and manipulate in this human sense, how can we best manage with invasive species? So that's going to be changing how we think about them, seeing what we can benefit from them, what are their medicinal properties, what materials can we use from them, can they be fiber, can they be mulch, can an animal graze on this, can this be made food for people, is this good for pollinators, changing how invasive species can become an economical positive opportunity for people was a really big point of the book. And how kudzu is one of the worst invasive species in the US. Could we have goats graze on it? And then that farmer who is now controlling kudzu with their goats is getting a protein rich benefit from an invasive species, and their goats can go ahead and make milk, and the flowers from the kudzu could help their neighbor who's a bee farmer, and that bee farmer is now making money from the kudzu, and the kudzu is also a nitrogen fixer, so it's helping their soils. And through this heavy use of it, we're managing and cutting back that population instead of just trying to eradicate it with chemicals that we know we're going to stay in the environment, are going to be very persistent to breaking down. And when they do break down, they're breaking down into more toxic chemicals, and they're staying in those soils, and they're not really helping what we want to be there. Overall, I think that the book did a really good job. Its points were really clear, and just we want to change how you think about invasive species. We want to change how we approach this as a management practice. It many times specifically talked about how it wants to get this point across to foresters, to people who are in the horticultural businesses and industries, to people who garden, just everybody. And as somebody who's going to school for urban forestry, I feel like they definitely reached their target audience, at least with me. Something that I wish I could have seen more was touched on invasive insects. They had less than a page on EAB, which is a significant threat to urban forests. They suggested basically planting different trees. The chemical they touched on is not very popularly used anymore, and is actually used in significantly less quantities as the one that they mentioned, which was triage is the trade name of it right now. I would say most people that I've talked to in the industry, and the only thing that I've used is mectinite, which is the trade name for emamectin benzoate. I'm not sure what the studies are on that, but it's used every 2 to 3 years instead of every year. But you do have to continually use it for the rest of the tree's life to ensure that it won't be reinfected with emerald ash borer. They also touched on and said that, well, emerald ash borers only attack stressed trees. We haven't had enough water. That's why they're attacking the trees, which drought can definitely be a big contributor. But when we're looking at an urban forest where the biggest issue is going to be compacted soil on top of drought, on top of everything else going on in an urban environment, it's hard to find a tree that isn't stressed. And keeping people who live in these areas where these trees are now fully mature is what's most important. And so that does mean that the use of pesticides might be the best management practice, because the cost of removal might not be too much for a municipality at one time. And also the effects of, that those were giving to help combat heat islands in urban cities is all going to be lost at once if we just do removals and replantings. It's also really hard for new trees to get established in urban environments. Typically, street trees are going to live less than 10 years, and most will die in 2. And ash trees were typically planted after Dutch elm disease came through. So when all these elm trees died, they planted a lot of ash trees and silver maples. Silver maples are notoriously weak-wooded, and they're falling apart as they age, we're reaching about right around that mark now, at least in Madison. And losing ash trees on top of that is really difficult and a lot on the system at once. And I don't know how we can necessarily use a economic benefit to emerald ash borer. It's just really disappointing to not have that touched on, I guess. But there is a lot of good information there. Another point in the book, they talked about trees being systems. It was in the chapter regarding a systems thought approach. And although it was a really good analogy and definitely touched on what they want, they mentioned trees healing wounds. And that was a little frustrating as an arborist, just because trees don't heal wounds, they conceal them. This was a main point on Alex Shigo's life's work. He was considered the father of modern arboriculture, and he fought really hard for these to be accepted as the standard understanding of tree defense mechanisms. And he was criticized and mocked, and it is now accepted by the International Society of Arboriculture and the USDA Forest Service as how trees deal with damage and decay. And so I just feel like that seemed to be lacking as well. I think that the authors focus was a lot more on herbaceous plants, and so that's just why those 2 key points I was disappointed in, but the rest of it is very good content. I think they did a really good job on approaching a lot of issues and tying them all together and making you see a whole picture versus a million tiny pieces. And it's definitely really motivating to want to help more in a permaculture sense and wanting to do not what's good for the environment, but what's best with what we have. If you're interested in invasive species or permaculture, I would really recommend the book. I think it was really interesting. The first chapter about ethics can get a little drony because they're really breaking it down into how many layers of just like toxicity there are and what the testing is, but it was really eye-opening as well.